Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. In this episode, I'm speaking with the founders of Stackup, CTO Andy Graham and Dane Eldridge, the CEO, about why so many tech leaders struggle to clearly articulate the value of their team and how benchmarking can uncover what's working, what's missing, and where the hidden risks are lurking. Andy brings 30 years of experience leading large-scale technology teams and navigating M&A due diligence, while Dane, a serial entrepreneur from Sydney, Australia, has worked with hundreds of tech teams and knows firsthand what separates performing CTOs from those just treading water. Together, they've built Stackup to answer a deceptively simple question. What's the real state of your tech function? And how do you know? I'm your host, Adam Horner. As a coach for CTOs across startups and enterprises, I help technology leaders escape the constant pressure of reactive leadership and build the confidence, clarity, and skills to lead strategically at the executive level. Through practical, personalized coaching, I help CTOs align engineering with business priorities, delegate effectively, and step fully into their role as a respected, trusted peer at the leadership table. This podcast enables me to bring some brilliant playbooks to you and the many CTOs looking to broaden their perspective. Together with my guests, we explore the strategies, frameworks, and lived experiences that can help you lead with greater impact and purpose. Andy, Dane, thanks for joining me. It's really great to have you on the recording today.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
Good to be here, Adam.
Yeah, it'd be really great to just get a bit of a background. So both of you have founded a company called Stackup, but just take us back a little bit. Dane, talk us back a little bit around your sort of background and how you came into working with Andy.
Yeah, so I founded a software development agency about 23 years ago when Andy was one of my clients. So we worked together on a number of projects and got on really well. And I think over that time, running that business, I got to work with hundreds of CTOs, saw the good, the bad, and the ugly of what lies beneath potentially a nice outward-looking story. And some CTOs achieving incredible things on shoestring budgets. And on the flip side, some CTOs spending enormous amounts, not achieving very much and getting lots of credit. And thought that was a bit strange. So that was part of my side of the inspiration for Stackup. And Andy kind of, has his own side to it as well. So, yeah.
That's probably a good segue into getting Andy's background on this then.
Yeah, sounds good. So my background, I've been in technology for around 30 years. I know I don't look that old, but there you go. Aged well. That's what you get when you move to Australia. I spent most of my career in automotive and financial services. Majority of that with a business called SG Fleet, who are the largest fleet leasing business in Australia. Pre, during, and post that 15 years at SG Fleet, I spent a lot of time doing due diligence on acquisitions, both potential, actual acquisitions, investment, and outright purchase. And one of the challenges I had was when looking at businesses, as well as running a large technology team, part of my job was also to look at businesses and evaluate the health of the tech function. A lot of businesses that I'd go into, they would start with, I've got ISO or I've got SOC 2. And the problem that we have is compliance doesn't make you good. So anyone with enough time, money, and patience can achieve compliance. But that doesn't make you healthy. It doesn't make you good. It doesn't mean you've got the right attitude. It doesn't mean you've got the right foundations to grow a scalable business. So without any reliable external standards to go with, I developed a playbook, coincidentally, the CIO Playbook or CTO Playbook, if you like, say, how do I evaluate the health of a tech function? So rather than asking 500 different questions that don't necessarily get you to the point of knowing if something's healthy, I distilled that down to a core set of questions that I knew based on doing it many, many, many times over, what good looked like, what bad looked like, and everything in between. And then a couple of years ago, chatting to Dane in a coffee shop, we were talking about, what do our futures look like? And, Dane's obviously been very successful in his career. Very different to mine. Mine's been very corporate, kind of that traditional corporate institution, whereas Dane's had that, amazing ability to build his own business and run his own business, which is something I've always looked to do as well. And ultimately, we came up with the idea of Stackup and we launched it last year, but all based on that kind of history of that combined history of Dane looking at that external lens of businesses that we've worked with as customers or prospects, and mine more on the due diligence, but also being a CIO and CTO for 20 years, I knew where the skeletons were hidden. So I knew exactly where to look because people were looking for them all the time with me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very common thing, isn't it? When you're sort of looking at a company, are they worth what you think they're worth or what you hope they're worth? And then how do you figure that bit out? Dane, do you mind if I just sort of switch over to you then and just sort of go through some of that background? Because as Andy said, you've built a couple of businesses. So I've been a founder as well. What on earth possessed you to do it again?
It's all Andy's fault. I swore I wouldn't do it, but I guess we saw an opportunity there just to add a lot of value. There seems to be a real gap in the market. And I think a generation of sort of software developers in particular that are being promoted to sort of CTO roles that have great, deep coding experience. But outside of that, there's massive gaps. And look, it just looked like too good an opportunity to pass up. And the opportunity to work with Andy is obviously a big part of it. We just really enjoy working together and set a pretty rapid pace and work pretty intensely. So swore I'd never do it, but enjoying it again. So yeah.
It's amazing how you look at the same gap in the market and come to completely different conclusions. I looked at those sort of techies turned CTOs and thought, I've got an opportunity to coach them.
Yeah.
And you thought, we've got an opportunity to figure out where they've gone wrong.
Yeah.
So, but talk to us about this idea of sort of interrogating the tech function and working out where the skeletons are hidden, as Andy put it. What is the sort of the core value that you're finding that people find from doing that diligence? Is it just in the M&A process? Or are you finding that this is much more widely applicable? Talk to us about how you sort of figured that out and what's been the sort of discovery process of where the value is.
Yeah, it's much broader than due diligence. Obviously, due diligence is one aspect of it, but really there are lots of triggers for people to run a StackUp assessment. Really, the common thread that runs through all of them is just some level of uncertainty about the technology. So is my CTO doing a good job? Are our foundations healthy? Are we secure? Are we ready for AI? Or, for other execs, it might be, I've just come on board as CEO. I want to get a lay of the land really quickly. Or I've just joined the board. I want to make sure that I'm meeting my sort of governance requirements around data privacy and security. How do I do that? So, I think ultimately all of those different people, all of those different leaders, or even a CTO coming into a new role, it's a great way to get an understanding of the current state of technology. So there's really a bunch of different reasons that people will look to do a StackUp assessment, but they're all looking for the same core understanding of where are the gaps. And I think it's really where a lot of the value is in finding those unknown unknowns. They might have a concern about a particular area, but it's the thing that they hadn't even thought about that's from left field. That's really the dangerous bit, and the bit that they end up going, oh, wow, glad we discovered that. Now we're going to do something about it.
Don Rumsfell's got a lot to answer there on the unknown unknowns, hasn't he? But
just going back to the CTOs that have been promoted as well, that the reason that's an important one is what we find is it's not malicious. There's nothing negative about that. It's just a skills gap. If you're brought up in a certain discipline, a software developer, you just don't have exposure to, what is then a 50% part of the role of a CTO outside of just managing software. It's not that they don't want to uplift or gain those skills. They just haven't had exposure to it. And what we do in a very, very short space of time, it's like a very fast and efficient way of saying, by the way, you need to skill up in all of these areas. And they're not theoretical, hypothetical areas that go, well, yeah, maybe I should, but what's the value? That we actually give the outcome, the tangible reason why it's important. We've got videos that explain real life horror stories of what happens if you don't understand these areas. It's not a negative, no one's done anything wrong. There's gaps in the skill set, and we can help very quickly identify those gaps for the individual to then learn and be coached or trained or skill up in those particular areas.
And that's one of those things I find in my coaching quite a lot is people just don't know where the best practice is or where there's the frontier of current execution and expectation is in terms of what they're looking at. And so what you're saying is that it's not just the value of figuring that out, but also understanding what good looks like, or in your case, what bad looks like, the cautionary tale, if you like.
Yeah, precisely.
And that's sort of 30 years of you experiencing it, looking at companies and going,
that's it.
Oops.
Yeah, exactly. And another big one for us is language. So, I've been in situations where someone will have made a statement in a meeting about how they do something, and the language that they use, I'll use the word automation, right? It's a good example. So automation means different things to different people. So there's an experience I had probably 10, 15 years ago where the term automation was used in a meeting, and we walked away from the meeting saying, great, these guys have got full automation, because we understood automation very differently to how they understood automation. So when we actually came in and we'd done some work with the business, and then we actually went and boots on the ground, we went, hang on, this isn't automated to what we think automation is. It was automated to what they thought was. So there was still humans involved, and it was a little bit of friction in the process. And again, that was just my experience and learning. Even a simple thing like that language on the word automation just means different things to different people. So what we've tried to do in the assessment is say, well, how do you take those potential nuances or idiosyncrasies out of the process and just have a common way of speaking and alignment on language? The questions are structured and curated very carefully to avoid any misinterpretation of what somebody means when they say something.
And clearly that is born out of experience. I mean, Andy, just take us back a little bit to, to when you were sort of in the trenches going through that 15 years, I think you said, of sort of M&A for the vehicle manufacturer there.
Yeah.
What were some of the situations where you had a good example there. Have you got any other examples of where like, oh my goodness me, we thought one thing and they totally had a different view on what that is and how it should work?
Yeah, I mean, another example, I guess, slightly related, but where people misunderstood the value or didn't see the extent of what was required for an IT due diligence was where, we were coming to the end of looking at a business to acquire, and the IT due diligence was left till the very end, as it typically is, right? And again, we've spoke to a lot of PE and VC now, and it's like, we'll do tech due diligence if we've got time, if we've got money, if there's some capacity at the end. And the example I had there was the whole enterprise architecture shift that needed to occur that was going to, circa $5 million there or thereabouts, and it hadn't been factored into any of the numbers. So towards the very end of the deal, it's like, that's why you have to start and look at IT, because especially now, and this was 10, 15 years ago, probably even longer now, when IT technology wasn't necessarily the backbone of technology, of businesses as it is today. And even then it was at the very end, it's like, okay, so we need to budget $5 million here, because this work has to happen. This is not maybe we'll do it. We have to do this to obtain the synergies and do what we need to do. And we did, and it got factored in. But these are the types of things that non-technology executives, particularly, they just don't think about. Even to this day, that they don't realize the foundational importance of technology and what it means to the success of the business operationally. So that's another example where, just doing that due diligence and asking the right questions at the right time and having somebody in the room with that voice around tech just to highlight this was a material issue in the process, which thankfully
was. So $5 million was a material amount compared to the size of the deal. It wasn't
correct.
Sort of
it wasn't a small.
Yeah,
it wasn't a small number. It was a reasonable size number. Correct. Yeah.
And I think that's where it comes down to it, isn't it? Where it literally shifts the goalposts. Understanding something as fundamental as that is quite important.
Yes.
How would you say that would apply, sort of discovering that kind of, architectural shift that needs to happen, or, let's call it what it often is called today, technical debt that needs to be resolved?
Yeah.
If that was a situation where it wasn't an M&A situation, maybe the CEO, for example, was just unaware that this was the kind of migration that needed to happen.
Yeah.
How would somebody use that information, that value in a non-M&A scenario?
Yeah.
Typically.
So today, again, a lot of the tech function is focused on day-to-day BAU, right? They're not thinking long-term, how does this business scale over the next 3 to 5 years? So they're very much in the here and now. And what this assessment will do is force people to think about, well, what does this look like in 3, 5 years from now as you're scaling the business? So we do quite a lot of work with scaleups, particularly. I wouldn't necessarily say early stage, like really early stage, but as businesses are starting to think about how do they scale up over the next 3 to 5 years, what does the technology need to look like for them to have to get to that level that they aspire to be? And some of the, again, you've founded businesses. You start on the smell of an oily rag. You do as much as you can with as little money as possible. But what that means is you do develop technical debt very early, which is acknowledged, right? That's part of the process. That's not negative. That's just part of building a business. But if you also don't acknowledge and look at that technical and say, well, what does that mean over the longer term? As an example, I'll give you of a large business based out of Australia. I won't name who they are, break any confidentiality. They built a very successful business in Australia, and they built it on poor architecture, like really poor. And I could see at the time, I was looking at them, helping them build the system at the time. They spent 2 years moving that to AWS, 2 years and millions of dollars. Because when they first started the business, that's the time to make the right decisions. When you're nimble, you can shift, you can move the boat around pretty quickly. And the challenges that we see with a lot of tech leaders are so in the weeds, thinking about how do we build the business, how do we scale the business, not necessarily from an enterprise architecture perspective, more from a get stuff done as quickly as possible. And the challenge that you have there is trying to shift and move the boat when you're 2 years, 3 years in is much harder than it is at an early stage. So for anybody who is thinking about, scaling a business, building a business, growing a business, get on top of it now. It's so much easier. Again, I've seen it so many times. It's so much easier to build an enterprise architecture from the start. Much harder to go and retrospectively change and try and it's the old analogy of trying to change the engine of a 747 while you're flying at 30,000 feet, right? It's impractical. It's hard
doable,
to do.
But it's very painful.
It's doable, but it's very, very hard to do. Whereas if you do it early doors, it's far easier and far more cost effective as well.
There is a sweet spot though, isn't there? Because if you do it too early, then you're trying to sort of work on a stable system,
Correct.
Change something stable.
Correct.
And actually what we're trying to do is be agile and be in discovery mode to try and figure out what the challenge and the problem is.
Yeah, but importantly, what we do, and this is that and again, I'm going to use the term playbook, and I do apologize, but I'll use it again. But what we do is we build a playbook for them. So what we're saying, so there's a good example I had recently with a fintech. They're a startup, but they've got aspirations to be, a big business as most startups do. All it did for them was help to build a roadmap. It said, okay, this is where you are today. You don't need to have all that enterprise architecture in place. You don't need the level of security as a bank. You don't need to be there right now, but this is what you're going to need to do to get there. So what it did, it said in 18 months from now or 6 months, and there's trigger points, like we'll help them put together some trigger points that said, when this occurs, this is probably when you want to think about this and this and this. So it's not doing it now, but it's being cognizant of it and listening to people who have been around the blocks long enough to know you're going to need to do this at some point, whether you want to or not. Yeah,
there's just the grey hair figure this out a few times.
That's it. At the moment, they just want to move fast. And it's like, it's cool, it's awesome, we're having fun. It is, but at some point, you've got to become a teenager and then you've got to become an adult, and these things will happen. So what the assessment does, it gives you a recipe, if you like, to say you're going to do all of these things at some point. You don't have to do them now. You might have to do them in 6 months, but you should do them. It's the right thing to do. I describe
it as just enabling informed decisions, because there's a bunch of trade-offs you're going to make, right, about what you want to do now and what you want to do later. But without a framework that has all of these things displayed and that the exec team's on board with, people are kind of making decisions in a bit of a vacuum based on gut feel or just non-conscious decisions about these things. And I think that's where you can get into real trouble and make really expensive and painful decisions that cost you down the track.
My experience is good is whatever the CIO or CTO says it is. So
that's often
a non-tech executive,
gospel, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. And also because the non-tech executive, they don't know how to ask the questions. They just say, "You guys have got cybersecurity covered, right?" And they go, "Yeah, all good. Don't worry about it." What does that mean, right? If you've come with a software development background, again, not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you may have not had good exposure to what good cybersecurity looks like. How do you get that exposure? And that's what we try and help with. All right, we know there's still work to be done and there's still deep dive, but as a starting point, a jumping off point, it's a very quick and cost-effective way to develop that list of what needs to be done and start building out that knowledge gap of the existing CIO or CTO or tech leader. I mean, it doesn't have to be CIO or CTO, just the person who's responsible for tech can benefit from this.
Yeah. And that's probably a good point, Dane, at which to sort of switch back to you and say sort of, with all of that in place or understanding that, then in terms of using that value as a CEO or an executive leader within an organization, what would you say is the sort of the number one thing that organizations who use either a checklist or a due diligence or something like StackUp at a point when they don't need to use it, like for example an M&A or some other triggering situation like that, what would you say is the biggest value that you see organizations taking out of a diligence process like this?
I think it's confidence in decision making. So getting rid of that single point of failure, if you don't have a set of metrics to talk to, you get a story from the CTO. And again, every CTO is on a journey. So everyone's got strengths and weaknesses. This kind of gives you confidence that you're actually making informed choices. And that can save you from the major cyber breach that puts you on the front page of the paper for the wrong reasons or gets you into fines or legal action because you haven't protected your data properly. I think one of the most insidious bits is probably just slower innovation. If you get a bunch of these things wrong, you build up a bunch of technical debt, things just run slower and you're not sure why, and it's just a bit clunky, and that doesn't show up as a specific P&L line item, right? So it's difficult to manage. But these are all of the factors that contribute to a really healthy, high-performing tech function. So yeah, that's probably a bit of a roundabout answer, but I think it's confident decision-making that gets you to a position where you're innovating fast, making conscious decisions, and setting yourself up for long-term success. Because two organizations can sometimes produce the same end results, like the lag indicators might be really healthy for both companies until the day something goes really wrong in the one that hasn't got their foundations right. And so I think it's protecting you from those sorts of issues.
Right. So some of it's understanding the risks then in terms of what's lurking in the cupboard that could jump out at some point. But then I think the other thing you mentioned there, which is probably can resonate with a lot of leaders listening to this, and that is this idea of slowness. As CTOs, as tech leaders, we get accused of this all the time. And sometimes you have to stand up and go, no, look, this is the way it runs. And other times it's like, okay, there is actually some things that we could do to change the speed of this. And understanding it from an outside perspective, I think is a very valuable thing. And it's one of those things that I often come in and I'm asked for my opinion on very early on when I'm brought in as a consultant or an advisor into an organization. Is this slowness real, or is it just my sense that I want to go fast when I'm impatient?
That's a good one. I would say, again, I'll put my CIO and CTO. I've been asked that question a million times. If I had $1 for every time I've been asked that question, in fact, I'd only going to be sitting here having this conversation. Make it go faster. Why is the project taking so long? Look, I'd like to say we've got a silver bullet for that with StackUp. We don't. But what we are helping to do is bridge the communication gap. So for me, the biggest challenge that I see in CIO, CTO, or tech leaders to non-tech leaders is just communication. Right? You can have the best technology function in the world and you can be delivering the best software, but if you're not communicating effectively and you don't know how to communicate with the board or the directors or the non-technology executives, they don't know it. So what we start with, and I think what's been important to us, and we've delivered, I'm sure Dane will talk briefly about some of the additional materials we now produce as part of the assessment, bridge the communication gap. Because that's the key. When you're talking about how long something's going to take, or the speed, or the slowness, firstly, it's about setting expectations. You've got to start from the beginning and saying, we expect X, but consistently and continuously speaking with the stakeholders around when something changes, when something is more complicated. There's a common adage around that 90% of projects fail or 80% of projects fail. That number's meaningless. Failure is relative. It's based on what a person's expectations were on that project. So the reason that things are so high on project failure with software, particularly 90%, 75%, 80%, I mean, you could make whatever number if you like, it's relative. So that's the CEO saying, I expected it in 6 months, but it took a year. Well, that's because you've added 300 additional scope items to it. But that's failure from that perspective. So for me, whilst we do help bridge the gap on the communication, and that's a big part of what we're trying to do here, is educate people on how do you communicate, how do you speed something up and what is slow and what's fast. That's, to me, that's simply down to communication, setting expectations.
I'd also just speak to
I presume,
the
that
budget
actually starts that communication going again.
Correct. That's it. The StackUp report is a starting point to help bridge that communication gap. And it helps to understand how to communicate with non-technology leaders, speaking their language. Like the way that the report is structured and the way that we've delivered the materials, it's to try and bring it down to a level that you're not bamboozling them with jargon. Because that's one of the frustrations, and not in technology. And the example of t-shirt sizes and points, right? When someone says how long will it take, and someone says 10 points, I say, give me that nobody works in points. That's great for the technology function, right? That's fantastic. You work within your framework, but outside of that, when you're sitting in a boardroom or sitting with the executive, the stakeholders, they just want to know how long it's going to take. If you tell them it's XXL t-shirt size, right, we don't know what that means. So communication is critical. And what we try and do is demonstrate how can you communicate technology, matters and functions in a way that people can understand and digest. That's a big part of what we're trying to do here.
Because if you're a brilliant CTO functionally and you can deliver amazing things, but you can't communicate effectively why you need that budget, The first question I'm going to ask as CEO is, but why is the value? Well, sure, it's better, but better how? I think just that why it matters piece is really important. So I think part of what we deliver is a bunch of videos for each of the factors we assess that you can kind of hand to your CEO or your board and say, this is why it matters. Here are some practical real world examples of the implications of doing this well or not doing it. Which is helpful for just getting other stakeholders aligned and off your back as a CTO so that you can, be empowered to deliver what you know you can deliver.
And and I think that's one of those key elements, isn't it? That it's, if you've got something that helps educate the rest of your team as a leadership team, rather than just, hey, we're technology functional, we deliver stuff you ask for. If you get to that point where it's like, I'm one of that leadership team, the strategy is our strategy, not my strategy. So it is actually lined up. And so the rest of the team can make an informed decision with you about priorities, about what's going to take most time, about what we need to do, about where we need to invest. I think that's one of those key areas where a report like this helps significantly. Dane, do you want to just, it's probably a good point here just to actually talk a little bit more in detail about what the actual StackUp question set is, what it's based around, and what sort of typically is the approach for it?
So essentially, we've distilled down sort of the 500 questions you could ask about a technology function into 50 very specific questions, asked in a very specific order that we can then put through an algorithm, score, and produce what to do next and recommendations and risks and all of that. It covers areas like, it's quite diverse. So I think there's a lot of point solutions out there that might look just at security, for example, but ours looks at security, cloud and network, innovation, staff and training, operations, policies and procedures, vendor management. It's the entirety of the technology function. So it covers all of those bases. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, and just give us an idea of the kinds of questions that people are going to be looking at answering in there. And, how long does it take to typically run through an answer for your average CTO to go through and do this? Is it like high effort thing that takes hours and hours to go through when your VC insists on it? Or is it something you can get done in 5 minutes between lunch?
I think the simplicity is really important. So the assessment takes about half an hour, so 30 minutes. It really shouldn't take much longer than that. Andy, maybe you can speak to some of the specific questions, but they're questions that are objective questions, and there's a don't know option for each. So there's, again, answer it objectively and you'll get really, really useful insights. Andy, do you want to speak to a couple of specific?
Yeah, sure. What I would say is, and the line that I use quite regularly, when people look at the 30 minutes, they say, how can it only take 30 minutes? My answer to that is it's actually 30 years worth of experience is why it only takes 30 minutes. Because I've learned what not to ask and what to ask and how to ask it. And we've effectively, what it's been called, and someone came up with the great line a few weeks ago, they called it the common sense assessment, because we're not just ticking boxes. So a consultant or a compliance framework, they'll tick boxes. This is about common sense and tangible outcomes that provide meaningful value to a business. We're not just trying to be a compliance framework for compliance sake. So then the diversity of the questions, I'll give you some good examples. Things like, do you have a documented strategy aligning technology with organizations' objectives? That typically isn't asked. When you get audited or you get assessed or you go to a compliance framework, that typically isn't asked because people go, well, that's not really part of a compliance framework. And what we're saying is that these types of things are foundational to a well-running and a healthy, I cannot use that word enough, a healthy technology function. That's what we're trying to establish here. And we're trying to help people build a healthy technology function. We ask questions like, do you produce regular status reports for projects? Again, alignment, educate and align. How do you bridge that communication gap? So whilst we're not telling people how to do it, we're saying, have you got these things in place? Do you do them? Great. If you do, fantastic. If you don't, we can introduce you to people that can help educate and learn, or you just go and learn it yourself. I mean, the benefit of having AI now is you can go out and say, how do I do this? Which we are working on some advancements, which I'm sure Dane will cover up during the call. How do you dispose of equipment that contains data? Right? Simple things like that. So you've got a laptop, John's just finished the business, his laptop, we're not going to use that anywhere. Let's sell that. We'll make some money. Okay, what did you do with the data that was on it? And, sadly enough, in a lot of the assessments we've done thus far, people go, what? What do you mean? It's like, well, and was it encrypted? No. Okay, that's a problem. Another good one is, do you allow users to have a local administrator access on their devices? Software developers all want local administrator access on their devices because they want to be able to install the best IDE, whatever it may be. That's a problem. Okay. And people need to understand why that's a problem. So we try and help to educate people who don't necessarily understand why those are problems, on why they're problems and why they could be big problems. These are the types of recipes, and these are the elements of what ultimately can cause cyber breaches. All of these types of things. So it's
I really love that phrase about the common sense assessment, because, for me, having, worked in very, very secure environments where, sort of 101, on your day in, make sure you always have, fully encrypted disks everywhere, because it's absolutely required. And make sure you never throw anything out, because data exfiltration is a very real risk. In some cases to national security. For me, that's sort of straightforward. But that question about, is your goals in engineering aligned with the business? It's probably the number one thing that I actually end up helping people with my coaching, because it's such a straightforward, and you would have thought obvious thing to check. And yet very often I find exactly the same thing that you do, that there is a distinct misalignment between those two on many, many occasions.
And AI is the perfect, so everyone wants to chase the new shiny thing, right? So AI is the great one. The CEO says, you guys need to implement AI. And the technology guys go, oh, awesome. That's cool. Let's get to play with AI. Okay, so what's the point? What's the benefit? What's the objective? What's the deliverable? What's the success criteria? Fundamentals still matter. Digital transformation, that's what it is. AI is just a new version of digital transformation. Yes, you can do it faster. It's more sophisticated. It's actually higher risk now, because you can do it faster and it's more sophisticated. But fundamentally, the principles are the same. It's still a digital transformation. And the objective may be, actually, we're just playing, we're exploring, we're seeing what it can do. And that's great. But as long as the CEO knows that and doesn't come back to you in 6 weeks and say, right, so how much have we saved? Where's the operational efficiencies? Right, that's the important.
Where's the magic you promised me?
Yeah, that's it. And if it's everyone goes into it saying, we're just exploring at this stage, trying to understand what it can do, where it can benefit the business, and where we can apply it. And the answer maybe we can't. There's nothing in our business that benefits from AI. I find that hard to believe in today's day and age it would happen, but that is still possible. So that's kind of what we're looking for, is those things that people overlook. And I'll say it again, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've just seen all of these pitfalls many, many times over. And for me, prevention is better than cure. We're just trying to help people say, well, how do you prevent yourself from getting into a situation that may mean you're misaligned? That the board is looking at you saying, well, you're not delivering. It's like, yeah, but I told you guys, but you didn't tell them in an effective way with a strategy document that they could consume. You told them in a way that's very technical. Nobody understood it, but they all nodded their heads, because they wanted to feel like they knew what they were talking about, and no one would want to put the hand up and say, I don't know what you mean. I've been there. I've watched these things happen where I can tell you that 10 people in the room don't know what the person is saying, but they're not going to say it because they don't want to look in front of everybody like they don't understand what the technology guy is talking about.
And all it takes is one person to say, sorry, what was that? And then all the questions flow out. But yeah,
that was always me. I was always the one in the room saying, can you just explain to me in practical terms? What does that mean? Where's the benefit to us? Because you get the pre-sales executives from these technology companies. We had one guy come in, he said, I'm going to save you 40%. This was when ChatGPT was first kind of brought around. He said, I'm going to save you 40% from operational cost. And everyone's like, oh, this is fantastic. This is great. He's going to save us 40%. But hang on, just question. How are you going to do that exactly? Can you tell me the specific steps and the tangible outcomes? And of course, there's nothing. But everybody else in the room is going, this is great. Well, let's just do it. Let's crack on. So if the technology person in the room isn't questioning that themselves, they've got no chance. So they set themselves up for failure immediately.
I think another classic example is that kind of being accurate and correct isn't necessarily useful. So that kind of 150-page version of a very technical thing, if you're explaining that to non-technical execs, it may be right, but it's just not useful. They can't act on it. They're not going to understand it. And so I think having that level of simplicity that they can then, follow and act and make good decisions on is part of the job of a great CTO, but also something that StackUp helps with by giving you that language and that framework that everyone can lean on.
Yeah, that's great, because I often talk about discussing things in terms of analogies, simple frameworks. If we were driving a car, it'd be a bit like changing the steering wheel while we're driving.
Yeah.
It's like it's a very visual, immediate thing you get to grips with. And I've discovered it works in every industry except for the car industry. Then don't tell them that, because that's exactly why you can't do it. But I live in Gothenburg, where they build Volvo cars. So it's very common to come across situations here where I suddenly go, oh, hang on, no, the car analogy, let's switch to the plane analogy instead. Having that simple language to be able to discuss it, Dave, Very, very common thing. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if we're sort of talking about your average CTO, who are the majority of listeners to this, some tech business leaders, what would be sort of the trigger or prompt that you would say is worthwhile going through an assessment like StackUp? And what would you say is sort of the steps and the processes to go through to get the most out of it?
I think if you've just started a new role or been promoted into a new role, it's a great way to identify those unknown unknowns. If you're making sure that the organization is actually prepared fundamentally for AI in terms of the way it protects data and policies and procedures and training, I think just that prep for AI is a good trigger. And I think probably that misalignment, if you're having struggles getting the exec team on board or getting budget approval or getting the credit you deserve if you think you're doing a great job, StackUp's a great way to kind of independently show that it's not just your opinion on a thing, but there's this independent framework that's been vetted by CTOs around the world that kind of confirms or supports what you're saying. Yeah.
And just for those who want to elevate their capabilities.
Yeah.
That's a big one. You just say, how do I become a better CTO? That for me was, in all honesty, what was born, or what this product was born from was me. I always wanted to strive to be better. I used to lie awake and I say, what have I not got covered in the tech function? Where are the gaps? What could potentially fall over tomorrow? I had plenty of war stories. We could do a 2-hour podcast just on war stories, right? Breaches, system outages, single point of failure, IP leaving the business, all of those things. So I used to lie awake going, what have I not covered today that needs to be covered? And StackUp, the assessment, it covers all of the bases. It leaves no stone unturned in terms of the foundations for running a healthy tech function. And it can apply to any business globally. Tech function to tech function. So whether in Dubai, Gothenburg, Sydney, London, Hong Kong, technology foundations are largely the same.
And I think that's a wonderful use case actually, is I'm a CTO. I've either just come into the business or there's been a significant change. And I really want to get some coaching because either, that transition or that change that's upcoming is slightly intimidating, or because, I know that there's areas where I need to level up and improve, justify it. Yeah. And I think a StackUp report 100%. Is quite a good one to be able to say, yeah, we've got these things covered, but what about these other areas?
Yeah.
And so therefore, hey, there's this coach who can help me cover those areas, and that's kind of proves the gap. Yeah. I have something very, very similar myself called the CTO maturity model, but it doesn't look at the whole business. It looks at just the CTO themselves.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that sort of can be seen as like, well, that improves you, but then you can go and get another better job somewhere else. Whereas I think like a StackUp assessment looks at the actual business itself and the potential in the business, or the standing risks that might be lurking.
Yes, exactly. And what we've recently done, and I might get Dane to briefly touch on what we've augmented the assessment with in the last 6 weeks. We've made some significant enhancements, which Dane, you may want to briefly touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the recent stuff. So obviously there's the PDF report, which is great for distribution. But what we found that the things we've added recently is a video report of a CTO essentially talking the execs through each page of the report, page by page, just like a briefing to the board. So again, really useful for getting stakeholders understanding and aligning, because to be fair, the number of non-tech execs that will receive a report on technology and their eyes glaze over, no matter how important it is, they get to page 2 and they're like, all right, hopefully the tech guy's got it covered. So that video really helps. But the other piece, we also now produce a podcast, 30 minutes for each company that completes a StackUp assessment, a 30-minute podcast on their technology. And we've been getting amazing feedback from that about the way that both kind of entertains and educates about the state of the technology that they have at the moment, and also kind of what to do about it. Again, just a really useful tool for getting the broader leadership team aligned and on board, and in a way that the people that aren't going to read the report can still sit in the car or go for a walk and listen to the podcast for half an hour and come away from that much, in a much better
Is that
position.
based on a similar kind of approach that Google's Notebook LM uses then in order to be able to turn something into an audio version?
Extremely similar. You might even find it,
Oh, you actually have used that. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, but the use case there then is essentially, that's the kind of thing you can give to the CEO and say, hey, just listen to this on your next commute or your next air trip to the other office.
Yep. And the video itself is 5 minutes long. So what we've tried to do is say, like, the report itself is very easy to read. We've made it, we've structured it, the language, but if someone says, get the report, it's another PDF report. What else can we do to educate and align? So we've got the video, which is 5 minutes. Again, 5 minutes. It doesn't take long to read through. You put out 1.5 speed, you get through that in no time. And then you've got the podcast, which is 30 minutes again. You put out 1.5 speed, you get through that pretty quickly. There's no excuses. Like, how do you educate in a line? This is it. You've got a report, you've got a podcast, you've got a video.
So it's super easy to consume the output and understand the context.
Correct. Yeah.
Brilliant. What's the sort of next steps on from there then? So we've got the CEO to understand. We've probably even got the CFO to look at it at this point. If it's only 5 minutes of tech, they can normally stomach that much.
Yeah.
What's the next step on from there that you recommend that you see, CTOs or your customers sort of using, taking advantage of?
Yeah. So the other asset that the platform produces is a draft technology strategy. So essentially what you should be doing next. And Andy, maybe you can kind of speak to acting on that. But I think from the non-tech exec perspective, it gives you that strategy that you can then hold the team accountable for. And you should see over time an improvement to your score. So if nothing else, at its very simplest form, the rest of the non-tech execs can kind of watch that score improve and know what questions to ask, sort of track things over time. But Andy,
and that's a really key point. So Andy, just before we go onto the technical part of that, this is the first time we've mentioned sort of running the assessment multiple times. So, I mean, that's something you just slipped in as though it's really normal. And that's probably not something that most CTOs listening are thinking, due diligence, you do it once, right? Why would you do it again?
Yeah.
But so talk us through this sort of, the idea of going through it again and changing the score over time.
Yeah. So traditionally it's hard to do this, right? Because you might not be able to afford a CTO consultant for 60 grand to come in and do a big deep dive every quarter. But because our platform is so quick and simple, it takes you 30 minutes. We sort of think that quarterly is about a healthy cadence to do this on. So things will change in the organization, circumstances, staff, technology, it's changing faster than ever. So we think resubmitting quarterly is about the right cadence to kind of just check on how things have changed. And we've seen a bunch of clients, the majority of them who see an uplift because they've made positive change and improved things. But we've also seen somewhere where that hasn't been the case, where they've had a bunch of disruption in their business. And there's been a few areas that have actually decayed over time due to lack of attention. And so that's a really healthy sort of set of metrics to measure and manage over time, because it's continuous improvement. It's not just a single point in time.
So an objective view of the whole tech function quarterly that even the CFO can understand, that the CEO can sort of go through in a 30-minute summary of it.
Yeah.
That sounds powerful for being able to sort of keep everything on track and making sure that you're not, taking your eye off the ball in terms of tech investments from that top leadership perspective.
Yeah. Also
what's
the
not
CTO to take
that?
into your performance review and sort of say, hey, look, I've taken us from here to here. You can see the change and you can see the specific areas. It's not just a story that I'm telling. It's based on these objective measures. Yeah. We've improved the operational excellence of the tech function.
Yeah. And in terms of articulating to people what to focus on, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. And you get a lot of consultant reports and they just kind of tell you all the things that they need to come in and help you do, right? It's the classic, they ask for your watch, tell you the time, give you it back and charge you 20 grand. So what we do is, rather than trying to boil the ocean, we tell you the 4 things to focus on. So we say, if you don't do anything else, just focus on these 4 things. That's it. Don't worry about the rest of the things that you could do. Just focus on these 4 things. And that's based on our unique scoring algorithm. And then what we've got after you've done the 4, you rerun the assessment and it'll surface the next 4. And if those next 4 aren't material and your score's gone up, happy days. There's things that you can still improve on, but at least you've focused on the key risk areas. And we're not just surfacing everything and saying, this is now a priority, that's now a priority. It's like, if there's nothing that falls into that material nature and at risk, then you're doing good. That's the key. It's like, we're not trying to continually punish people and say, we've got to do this, got to do that. Like, you've fixed the 4 at-risk areas. That's really good. Now there's other things you can improve on, but you've kind of covered the big ones. Sleep at night, knowing that you've got multi-factor put in place. You've got encryption on your devices. You've now got a strategy document aligning the non-technology executive with the technology executive. These are important things. But importantly, every quarter reassess. If you've stopped doing that and you're not keeping it up to date and you're not testing your BCP and you're not testing your DR and all the fundamentals, then your score's going to drop. So this is continuously maintained. It's easy to get there. It's like, they say with elite sports, that it's easy to get there. It's hard, but once you're there, you're still going to work hard to maintain it. It doesn't happen by default. So that's an important part of it of us, is how to maintain that cadence and that rhythm, that operational excellence.
And I think that's another important point to come back to the actual score? Because you come out with an objective single value score.
Yeah.
How objective is that? Can I sort of rely on that? Go, if it's above a certain value, then I can sort of kick my feet back and go, okay, all I need to do is maintain it now. Is it that objective?
Dane, you want to take that one?
Yeah, look, I mean, yeah, all of the questions are objective. So if you answer those questions honestly, and it's going to give you an accurate score. So yeah, it will. And look, I think we've done it on enough companies now to see that it is a really good representation of where the organization's at. Like there's no assessment where you go, actually that seems a bit unfair, or that's
we had one company who said, oh, that seems unfair. And then we had a very brief conversation, and they very quickly realized that once I held a mirror up to themselves, they went, oh yeah, no, that's right. We're just telling you what you've told us, that's all. Now, what I would say is if there are any concerns or challenges around, someone says, well, they got a score of 85 out of 100. That's amazing, but surely that's not correct. We have an insights and verification service where we can introduce very experienced and senior CIOs and CTOs in as, I know that again, that's not us doing that. This is independent to us, because the important part for us is to maintain that independence. But we do have that insight session, so they can get a 1 hour session. And within an hour, you very quickly realize if someone's gilding the lily or not being entirely, I wouldn't say, not being entirely honest, transparent, yes, with their answers. So, an example may be, yeah, we've got a DR and we test it regularly. Great. So just let's have a quick walk through that. So just show me the DR. Well, we probably need to update it. So, okay, so you don't really have a DR. Well, we do. When was the last time you tested it? Oh, I think we tested it about 4 years ago. Okay, so, so it's very quickly where you identify that maybe it's not entirely transparent the way that they've represented themselves in the assessment.
But as you pointed out, that sort of independent assessment is independent of you guys. This is where you introduce somebody, probably somebody like me, who's relatively close to business in the right time zone, who can just come in and spend some time going through the report and go through some of that sort of basic background from the point of view of, okay, I've done DD a few times, I know what I'm looking for here.
Correct. But what's important, thus far, we've had, I'm just trying to think of an instance where, I can't think of any instance where we've gone, I don't think they were being entirely transparent. Maybe one, and we've done over 100. One where I looked at it, I went, not sure. I'm not sure about that one. But yeah, that's what we're finding thus far is people actually want to improve. They want to get better, good transparency. So yeah.
And this is going to be down to the same sort of limits of every system. Good data in, you're going to get good data out. Rubbish in, rubbish out.
It's the traditional method. I could sit in front of a consultant. I can tell them whatever story I like. He's got to ask the right questions, have the right understanding. Same principle, except it costs you $35,000, takes 4 weeks. There's no different to that. And for us, it's about, you want to improve yourself. Be better, improve the business, improve yourself. This is not just about a checkbox or a compliance framework. This is, how do I become a better CTO, a better CIO?
Talking about making things better, it'd be really good to get a bit of an idea from you guys on where you're hoping to take this next. Because obviously it's a super valuable service. More and more businesses are picking it up. More and more folks like me are coming in to support after some of these DDs are done. Yeah. What are you looking at next?
So we've got some really interesting features planned around anonymized benchmarking. So once we get to just a little bit more scale, you'll be able to sort of say as part of the platform, all right, we're a fintech between 50 and 200 staff. How do we stack up against other fintechs between 50 and 200 staff? And actually, we're better at staff and training, but we're not so good at security. And we spend 3 times as much on average. That's interesting. So actually having that anonymized benchmarking data. And then I think, eventually we'd like to be a global standard like SOC 2 and ISO, but for operational excellence within technology. So a very practical version of that's available to all businesses. And ultimately building out, I guess, your kind of AI-powered CTO or CTO assistant, based on this unique data set that we have, kind of current state of technology and what's working and how people are uplifting to just up the level of tech excellence across the world. So yeah, having that kind of virtual Andy by your side that you can chat to and ask questions of and get that insight.
You can choose a different accent though. You don't have to listen to a Northern English accent.
But I think that is something that's going to be interesting, because I think a lot of CTOs are sort of looking at their engineers and going, well, they've suddenly got pair programming sorted out because every engineer can now have a pair programming much more intelligent version of the rubber ducky. Where do I get it from myself as a CTO?
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that you're actually working towards that actively now, where you can be that active participant from an AI on, if I were to do this, then what would that mean? What have I not thought of? Where are my blind spots, etc.?
Correct. But it's tailored specifically to your organization with your data set. So this isn't a generic, well, I'll just ask GPT and it'll give me an answer. This is answering in context to your organization, knowing you, knowing your history, if you've done the assessment many times. So it's very, very specific to your circumstances, which is where the uniqueness comes in. It's not just a wrapper on top of, something else that already exists. This is on top of your data set, and the data set that contains aggregated and anonymous data from other organizations who you can see how they've improved over time and how they've improved their score without giving anything away, of course. But yes, it's a very powerful data set that we're building.
Excellent. So that's using that same sort of sector-specific, size-specific data that Dane was just mentioning there. Yeah. Cool. So Chief, I just summarize it then. So, in terms of when to use something like StackUp, or indeed when to go and find your local DD consultant to look at things, whenever you've got a significant change, it's a new role, whether you need to show some progress, or where you need to figure out the areas you could improve as a CTO.
Yeah.
And then use the results, the written PDF, the video, and the audio. So step 2 is to send that on to the rest of your leadership team, because if they can't follow 5 minutes of a video, then there's something else wrong. But then also that number 3 is using that sort of holding the candle to the tech strategy. In other words, be able to do that second test, those priorities, those initiatives that should be high up on the list, using those to inform your next steps and your priorities over the next quarter, say.
Yeah.
And then step 4, track changes over time. So really use that as a regular test set to be able to go back to. And that's something where this stands apart from other DD processes where, sure, you can go to your trusted due diligence consultant or the one that your VC asks you to use, or PE, private equity, is now getting significantly into this, especially at transaction time, doing due diligence. But those folks, well, I should say we tend to charge more than you guys will. So being able to do this regularly to be able to help sort of shape and form and get yourself to that sort of green mark of, we're on track, we're in the right direction, and we're not sort of missing anything in the overall approach to technology. Did I miss anything out of the sort of the rough steps in the playbook there?
No, I think that's pretty much spot on.
We'll use that.
As you know, I'm big on creating playbooks out of everything I can. Repeatability is the secret to execution, isn't it?
I agree, mate. We're cut from the same cloth.
How can folks find you?
Go to our website, which is stackup.tech. That's probably the best place. We're pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can find us there. But stackup.tech is the place to go, and check it out.
Excellent, cool. And so, in terms of the sort of the next few things that are coming up, what does sort of the next 6 months to a year look like for you guys? Just out of curiosity.
Wow, we are so deep in execution mode at the moment. Look, there's a bunch of platform improvements that are planned. So there's a whole heap of features and development that'll be released. I think it's for the next little while, there's going to be a bunch of just spreading the word, getting the awareness out there that the platform exists, because as far as we're aware, there's nothing else out there globally that does this. So awareness in the short term, and in the background, pretty exciting product build with a bunch of new features that are going to be super valuable.
Brilliant. Dane, Andy, it's been great to have you. Thanks so much for your time on the playbook today.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Much appreciated. Cheers. Thanks, Al.
Thank you very much for listening all the way through to the end. Just before you go, I'd like to ask you for one thing in return for putting together all these episodes of the CTO Playbook podcast for you. Please leave a review. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whichever platform you're on, leaving a quick review will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.